You're listening to Factual America. This podcast is produced by Alamo Pictures, a production company specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for international audiences. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Alamo Pictures to be the first to hear about new productions, festivals we're attending, and how to connect with our team. Our homepage is alamopictures.co.uk. And now, enjoy Factual America with our host, Matthew Sherwood.
Welcome to Factual America, a podcast that explores the themes that make America unique through the lens of documentary filmmaking. I'm your host, Matthew Sherwood, and every 2 weeks it is my pleasure to interview documentary filmmakers and experts on the American experience. We're coming to you from Spiritland Studios, our home away from home here in King's Cross, London, England. And today's topic is the 2020 U.S. presidential election special religion edition. So our guest is Dr. Emma Long, senior lecturer in American Studies at the University of East Anglia. Welcome to the show, Emma.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, so I gather your research focus is Constitution and the Supreme Court, interaction of religion and politics, separation of church and state, First Amendment issues, and you're a founding member of Scholars of Religion in American Life Research Network. Do I have all that right?
You do indeed, yes.
Okay, very good. Well, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you.
I think we've got a great show lined up today, a topic we haven't really discussed too much here on the Factual America podcast, which is religion in America, even though I think for many non-Americans, people outside the U.S., it's one of the defining elements, at least has been historically. People see America as this the odd man out, if you will, in terms of Western democracies and countries of being very religious. Religiosity seems to be a characteristic. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's one of the things that seems to puzzle a lot of people from outside the United States because of this idea that the U.S. apparently has a separation of church and state. And yes, every time you look at American politics or political life, religion is there, whether it's candidates talking about their religion or religion playing a role in debates about policy issues. And I'm not surprised you didn't talk about it, especially in the UK, because, of course, as the people in the UK tend to say, you don't talk about religion and politics in polite company.
Yeah.
So.
And even politicians have said we don't do God.
Yes,
famously,
yeah.
in this country,
particularly in this country. Yeah.
So, as you know, the format of the show is that our guests choose a documentary to serve as a backdrop, and you chose Most Hated Family in America. The Louis Theroux doc, for TV, made for the BBC. He filmed, wrote, and presented. It's part of a trilogy, actually. Looks at the Phelps family and the Westboro Baptist Church. It's, I would say, in terms of TV docs, it's almost reached iconic status, I would think. It's something that even my children at schools see in their RE classes.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so, why did you choose this film? Besides the fact that we made you choose a film.
There's something very interesting about the documentary, but about the Westboro Baptist Church in general, and the three films that really kind of cover the recent history, should we say, of the Westboro Baptist Church. I'm less interested in the church itself, or in fact the people who make it up, and in some ways they don't need any more publicity from me talking about them. They're very good at making their own publicity. But I am interested in sort of the documentary, but also what the church does as symptomatic of something broader in American politics, which is, I think, that it symbolizes for many people outside the US of sort of the worst kind of connection between religion and politics. And I think it's become a bit of a lens for the way in which people think about religion and politics in the US, which is, while it's not inaccurate, is not the whole story. There's a bigger picture.
Because these people are at the very extreme.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no question that they are not necessarily representative of even kind of what you might think of as being mainstream conservative religion before you even get to mainstream mainline religion in the United States. So yeah, they're very much an extreme, but the tendency of particularly documentaries about religion and American life to focus on the extremities means that it becomes the lens through which a lot of people come to understand what that relationship is.
Well, it does remind me, I lived in Prague in the Czech Republic years ago, and I remember a young woman I was working with said, your country is one of extremes. And, every issue you can look at, it's about the extremes. And I think it is and it isn't. I think what dominates the airwaves is the extremes.
Yeah.
And maybe, before we go a little even further into that discussion, what would you say the most hated family in America is about?
It's about the family, the Phelps family, who constitute ultimately the majority of the Westboro Baptist Church. And my sense is that Louis Theroux wanted, as he does in many of his documentaries, to look beyond the headlines and beyond the sort of the political activity that they were involved in, for which they are very well known, and obviously ultimately were involved in a US Supreme Court case about that, which brought them to public prominence. He seems to be much more interested in understanding the family behind that, their kind of interactions with each other, sort of how the extreme views that they have shape the way that they think about the rest of the world, and also their relationships with the wider world and with each other. So it's very easy, I think, to dismiss people of extreme views when you just look at the views. It's easy to say, well, you're just an extremist, I don't have to engage with you. But the humanizing of the people who express that view forces you to engage with them as people, and I think to try and understand, if not to either condone or accept the views that they're expressing. And I think that's one of the strengths of the documentary.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think that's a very good point to actually look at our first clip, because I think it's about halfway in terms of this of the doc, and it is where, we've been seeing glimpses of it, but I think it's where Louis Theroux really focuses on the humanity. So I think that very well illustrates what you were just saying. I have to admit, I sort of avoided the doc for many years. I had not seen it until very, very recently, because I'm sort of sensitive to these issues you've already mentioned about how the rest of the world sees the United States. Certainly religiosity and people of faith. Even I wouldn't describe myself as a evangelical or a conservative Christian, but I think I do think they sometimes get painted as a. Well, let's face it. A lot of you look this up, you'll see films that are all about snake handlers and these very extreme examples of religion. And I think this actually points out we were discussing before the show, is that there's sort of a lack of good films about this subject. Yeah,
there tend to be, and of course the nature of, I think, filmmaking is that you want characters, you want a story, and the extreme instances do tend to give you that. Just to think of another one that came out recently, Hail Satan, which is about the Satanic Church of America, which actually is far less extreme than the name might sound. But again, is focusing on a group that has a very particular message, but which sort of pushes public opinion in very different extreme ways. And there is a lack of I think good documentaries on kind of mainstream Protestantism or mainstream Catholicism in America, and they are just as important and just as influential in shaping American politics, but they get a lot fewer headlines.
Yeah, and I think probably a phrase that might get mentioned a few times in this, as we discuss, is the culture wars, and I think these films get caught up in that. I think, and then invariably, I think sometimes people have agendas that they're trying to push with these films.
Oh, undoubtedly. And my sense is quite often, unless you are part of the sort of evangelical fundamentalist circuit, where there are documentaries that are made specifically for those audiences, which don't then tend to make it out into a mainstream audience unless you look for them. A lot of the mainstream programs are made, dare I say, from a slightly more liberal perspective, which can portray these groups in a slightly negative light, which then feeds into their reaction against mainstream society and the idea that they're not being taken seriously. So it all becomes a cycle.
Yeah. I think we're gonna go back to the Phelps family and Westboro Baptist Church in a clip later in the show. But let's take advantage of you being here. You're an expert. You're on religion and politics and the history. So I was born and raised in the United States. We're taught founding fathers were God-fearing men who pursued an ideal, and they instituted a strict separation of church and state because they didn't want a state religion or a tyranny of beliefs imposed on citizens. And what would you say the reality is over the last 240 years or so?
How long have we got for 200?
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, so no, I don't. Yeah, so don't do. We're not. Don't worry. Don't tune off. Don't hit the pause button. We're not going to go. But just to sort of quickly, this kind of, because it is such a. It is this defining element of the U.S.
It is, and I think that the debate about what the founders meant has become inherently politicized in the battles over the culture wars and the battles over. Public policy that has religious elements and divides religious groups, and it's very difficult to talk about what the founders intended without getting caught up in those battles. So one side will say they established a separation of church and state. They were and that they didn't want this sort of tyranny of religion, and that there should be a secular public square, right? Public debate should be conducted in secular terms because by its very nature, religious belief differs between different groups, and it makes it harder to find compromise, which then makes political activism more difficult. But then there's the other side of that, which is the founding fathers were God-fearing men. America's a Christian nation with a Christian heritage, and that excluding religion is discrimination against people of faith. And I'm a historian. It's never really black and white. Depends on where you look and what sources you look at. So there's something in between there. The Constitution doesn't establish a separation of church and state, even though that's the shorthand that we use. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. It's been interpreted as the separation of church and state, but laws respecting an establishment of religion are not quite the same thing. Yes, it meant that they didn't want an established church along the British mold. So there's an institutional separation between them, but that has never separated religion and politics ever in the United States. So anything that sees the founders as establishing that separation is just sort of inaccurate, effectively. I mean, you only have to look at the biggest debate of the 19th century over slavery. There are religious groups on both sides in the debate over slavery before the American Civil War. In fact, it divides American churches into northern and southern branches over their positions on abolitionism and the continuation of slavery. So, and that's just to pick one probably really well-known example. So when we talk about separation, we have to be careful, I think, about what we mean and how that then plays out.
Well, just even from my own personal memories, I remember the big issue when I was in school was all about prayer. In school. And, I can think from one year to the next, we never knew if we were going to, because I went to public schools, state schools, and you never knew whether we were going to have a prayer or not, from one year to the next, depending on what the latest, a decision was, if it had gone to the Supreme Court. People used to say, well, as long as there were exams, there will be prayers in schools. Yep. But, I think it is just sort of emblematic that we don't need to go down a whole show on prayer in school, but I think it's
we
just...
I could easily
You could easily while away the day with that discussion, and I can regale you with stories of invocations before Texas high school football games and things like that, and how different people reacted. But I think what this gets us maybe, and that was a very quick tour of American history up until sort of the 1970s or so. Obviously there has been this phenomenon, whether it's a fourth Great Awakening or not, and you can mention maybe briefly what these Great Awakenings are in the U.S. history, but there's obviously been this rise of the Christian right or Christianity with muscles since the 70s, basically.
Yeah. And I think when we think about religion and politics in the U.S. at the moment, rightly or wrongly, and probably at least more to a wrongly, we think about the link between conservative religious groups, conservative Protestants, evangelicals and fundamentalists, and also increasingly conservative Catholics and some Orthodox Jews as well. And there are increasing links with the policies of the Republican Party. So this kind of conservative religion, conservative politics link. And that really emerges. There are tendrils of that throughout history, certainly in the post-World War II period, but it really emerges clearly on the public, into the public consciousness, I guess. Actually, in 1976, with Jimmy Carter's presidential campaign. Now, interestingly, Carter, of course, was a Democrat. He was a liberal, but he was the first president of the modern era to be really open about his faith. He spoke about himself as being a born-again Christian, and evangelicals saw this as one of their own on the national public stage, and then very quickly he came to disappoint them, particularly on his pro-choice policies to do with reproductive rights, but also in a range of other areas. And then you get Ronald Reagan running for president in 1980, and it's not just him and his comfort with speaking about his faith in ways that really we hadn't seen that much from politicians, but that the conservative and Republican sort of party apparatus around him really made efforts to make connections with conservative Christians to sort of bring them into the Republican fold. And so you begin to see these connections linking up between policies and sort of religious faith, I guess.
It was almost personality driven. I mean, it's always this sort of chicken and egg argument, but you had people like Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, you had the moral majority who really came to the fore at this time, who, whether, I don't know which came first, but they certainly got put in touch with the Republican Party and the establishment, and that element kind of took over the party from about the Reagan era onwards. But what is it? I mean, we were discussing previously as well, and this is something, again, will come up quite a bit. Why do the Democrats struggle so much with this? Because they are kind of they are the party of no faith these days, and the Republicans are kind of seen as the party of faith.
Which is ironic. I mean, just to think of recent examples, listen to Bill Clinton's speeches. If you take almost any speech that Bill Clinton made, and he was very comfortable with speaking about his faith. His speeches were liberally sprinkled with quotations from scripture in ways that made it clear that this was familiarity. This wasn't speechwriters putting them all in. But there is this sense, certainly since Reagan, partly, I think, driven by these connections between religious and secular conservatives, that has very successfully portrayed the Republican Party as the party of faith and the Democrats as the secular party. It plays into debates about the culture wars as well, but it's been a relatively rare Democratic politician who has been able to break that. Clinton was one. Barack Obama was actually another. He was also very comfortable talking about his faith in ways that seemed very naturalistic. But it's notable that they were successful. Right? Yeah. Clinton and Obama were both elected, and there is some suggestion that part of that was their ability to reach out to people of faith in a way that, say, Hillary Clinton, who naturally was not inclined to speak about her faith in that way, was unable to.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting note. I mean, if you're a conservative Christian and you see a Democrat who's a Southern Baptist, you probably immediately say, no way, I know what I'm getting with that, because that's Carter, that's Clinton, Al Gore.
Yep.
But it is interesting, and but it also points this fact that so the successful ones very comfortable with their faith in terms of winning elections, Clinton and Obama, but for all this talk about separation of church and state, and as you say, it's not called that even in the Constitution. You've got to talk religion if you're going to win an election.
You do. I mean, there has never been an avowedly atheist president of the United States. despite the fact that actually another part of the Constitution explicitly says there should be no religious test for office. Historically, opinion polls have suggested that Americans trust atheists less than they trust almost any other group when you put them in positions of power, which makes it very difficult for those who are non-religious to get into that kind of situation. I mean, thinking about the current roster of candidates in the current election, the closest you have, I think, is someone like Bernie Sanders, who is by his own definition a secular Jew, but has sort of bristles when he's asked about his faith, and sort of says it's not something that's important, and has been quoted as saying that he is not actively involved in organized religion. But he's probably the closest that we've had for a very long time of somebody seemingly of no faith tradition in a kind of national political debate.
I think that probably gets to issues which I know we're going to cover later in the podcast, because I think because the question is worth asking, and we'll ask it again in a few minutes, is that is America changing in such a way that maybe it isn't as important to at least have some sort of professed, most likely Christian faith? But maybe this would be a good time, as we're still kind of backward looking, because we're going to talk about the current race and also 2016 a little bit. Maybe to show a second clip, I think.
Okay.
We're going to actually take it to the second in the series that Louis Theroux did. It's America's Most Hated Family in Crisis. It's from 2011. And maybe give us a little synopsis about what that film is about in terms of what's the issue, and it certainly plays in line with your own research interests.
Okay, so one of the things that brought the Westboro Baptist Church to public knowledge was its activities of protesting the funerals of service personnel who'd been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan in the early years of the 2000s, as a protest against what they see as America's tolerance of homosexuality. They would stand at funerals with picket signs, which I'm probably not going to tell you what they said. You can find them online. But they were exceptionally hurtful and both to the families of those whose funerals were taking place, and also to the LGBTQ community. Now, the church, one of its fundamental principles is that pretty much everything bad that happens in the United States is God's punishment for its intolerance of homosexuality. So when they picketed these funerals, they weren't saying that these particular service personnel were gay themselves, but making a broader political point. So in the run-up to the documentary, one of the fathers of a service member who had been killed in America's military interventions sued the Westboro Baptist Church for the distress that they had caused him at his son's funeral. The church responded and said, this is freedom of speech. We're talking about political issues. We're talking about political issues from a perspective of faith. This is protected by the First Amendment. And it was a Supreme Court case that went all the way to the US Supreme Court, and the documentary takes place against the background of that.
All right, so let's watch that.
You're listening to Factual America. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Alamo Pictures to keep up to date with new releases and upcoming shows. Check out the show notes to learn more about the program, our guests, and the team behind the production. And now, back to Factual America.
Welcome back to Factual America. We've been discussing, U.S. politics, religion, with Dr. Emma Long, and we just saw that clip from the second Louis Theroux film on the Phelps family in the Westboro Baptist Church. I mean, what I found interesting in the first one is that it comes out that many of the senior members of the church are trained lawyers.
Yes.
I guess you have to be.
Yeah, given some of their activities, they absolutely have had to be. And I mean, the Supreme Court case from 2011 was a big moment. It gave them national prominence, so they'd sort of got it from publicity anyway because of their activities. But the Supreme Court effectively said, while not agreeing clearly with what they were saying, they said these are views, these are comments on public issues. They're not standing right outside the churches or the cemeteries. They're abiding by all the laws. Therefore, the First Amendment right to free speech protects their right to do that. A decision that many people did not like. It should be said, including from many people who support freedom of speech, but taking this very long-standing view that the right to freedom of speech doesn't just protect the right for people to say things with which you agree or things that are not hurtful. The majority opinion from the Supreme Court made it very clear that the comments that were being made probably didn't add much to public discourse. There's some interesting asides in the opinion, but nevertheless came down on the side of the church saying that they had the right to do this.
Yeah. And was it? Did it break along the decision? Was it a 5-4? Did it break along conservative, more liberal lines? Or?
Actually, no, it didn't. It didn't divide liberal, conservative in ways that you might perhaps expect. It was actually an 8-1 decision, so it was overwhelmingly in favour of the right of the church to do this. And the one dissenter, Samuel Alito, is actually considered to be on the more conservative side. And his point was that these views were so hurtful and so damaging that that overrode many of the other concerns. I'm distinctly simplifying what is a complex legal opinion.
No, but
there was a majority, a very clear majority in favour of the church's right to do this.
That's very interesting. Well, let's bring this forward now because I think that was, as we said, I think that was 2011. I think let's bring it to 2016, maybe even 18 in terms of the last few election cycles in the United States. What role did religion play in the 2016 race?
That's there are lots of different ways in which you can answer that particular question. The one statistic that gets thrown around with regards to 2016 and that we are still talking about in many ways, particularly thinking forward to 2020, is the fact that 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump, despite the fact that many would argue that Trump's behavior does not exemplify a Christian way of living and that his ability to quote the Bible does not have shades of politicians like, for example, Clinton and Obama, who are actually quite comfortable with that. Now, there are problems with that 81%, as many people have pointed out, simply because definitions of evangelical vary. Some people who consider themselves evangelical don't necessarily belong to churches who think of themselves as evangelical, and some churches denominations that might think of themselves as evangelical, other people don't. So although the figure gets used, and I'm repeating it again now, there are some problems, should we say, with that figure. But what it does tell us is that overwhelmingly white evangelicals supported President Trump over other candidates, despite some of his behavior, which has led some commentators to ask why they supported President Trump.
Well, that's what I want to ask. I mean, his own relationship with religion and Christianity is a very interesting one. I think I remember some quote to the effect of about talking about it. He said, well, I think he said maybe the Bible was his favorite book or something like that. But he also said he's never asked God for forgiveness. Mm-hmm. I mean, because I don't think thinks he needs to. Probably. I don't know. We can't get inside of his head. Maybe that's a good thing. But why did he do so well? Do you have a view?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of reasons for this. One is, I think the fact that many conservative Christians have become so locked into the Republican Party since Reagan and to the policies that ultimately that is the defining issue. Who will take the stand that they want on abortion politics, for example, or gun rights, or other kind of culture wars issues, to use that term broadly. And they certainly didn't trust Clinton on that, and generally don't trust Democrats. But at the same time, there were a lot of interviews with Trump supporters, people asking about exactly this question. And people saying, well, Protestant faith, it relies on, everybody's a sinner. Everybody has to repent. People have the opportunity to learn, to ask for forgiveness. And they see Trump sort of in that mold, whether he asks for forgiveness or not. But they sort of take that position, nobody is perfect. Everybody makes mistakes. Trump has made mistakes. He has the opportunity to learn from them. We should extend some kind of understanding with regards to that. So there are lots of, complicated reasons as to why politics is part of it. The historical politics is part of it. Faith is another part of the story, but it's a big mix.
And is this just another, we mentioned it previously, is that just the Democrats don't know how to deal with the faith issue? I mean, I think so. Whoever isn't the Democrat, whether they're a perfect or imperfect candidate from a religious standpoint, stands in stark contrast to what the Democrats are not offering.
I think that there's part of it there, and also you have to remember, thinking about the idea of separation of church and state, the Democrats have historically been the party who have been supported by those groups who advocate most firmly for the separation of church and state. Jewish groups, for example, have historically been very pro-separation, about keeping a very big distance between religion and government. Mainline Protestants have also been that, and in some ways the same way that the Republican Party has become the party of faith over other things. The Democratic Party have spoken to a constituency that continues to support this idea that there should be a separation between faith and politics. And so, it's very hard if you've got that image to then suddenly start talking about your faith in a way that doesn't somehow suggest that you are violating that principle. So they've got those two difficulties.
And I guess there's certainly, and it's come up in other podcasts and discussions we have, is that there's certainly this increasingly polarization of American society. And I do think, I wonder if, and the Democrats are part of that as well. And they've got, as you say, each side's got their interest groups. And, you could say the Democrats have taken some hardline stands even about members of their own party and candidates in terms of, I don't want to derail this podcast with a discussion about abortion, but I think they're very locked into the pro-choice movement, and people who are pro-life. There are Democrats who have considered themselves pro-life who now feel like they can't even be part of that party anymore. So I think probably I would say that's even maybe an issue that hasn't been getting as much discussion in terms of what's maybe been driving some of the certainly maybe even the Christian evangelicals, because I think Catholics broke kind of 50-50 as they usually do with candidates, but certainly with the fundamentalist Christians or evangelicals, that's I think a big issue driving some of them.
And I think this idea of polarization is actually really important, because if we think back to the idea of the culture wars, it was sort of first put out there in academic scholarship by a sociologist called James Davison Hunter in, I think his book is 1991. And his argument was actually not that the culture wars were just about faith, but what he was identifying was this idea of a change in American sort of social thinking, between divisions between different groups, religious groups. So the decline of divisions between Catholics and Protestants and Jews and Muslims and others in the United States, towards a new dynamic which saw a split between liberal and conservative. Although he didn't quite use the liberal conservative terms. And ultimately that's sort of what we've seen as politics and religion has come to be more connected. What we've seen is that polarization has come to be along liberal and conservative lines, and that actually coalitions between conservative Protestants and conservative Catholics, which we now take for granted in the United States as part of the kind of the rise of the conservative right, or the religious right, to use the other term, in the 1940s would have been practically unthinkable. I do some work at the moment on the relationship between Protestants and Catholics in the United States in that kind of round the period of World War II and just after, and they were bitterly divided. So there is a story here about how these groups have come to work together, and Hunter's idea of the culture wars and this kind of more liberal conservative split sort of gives us one way to think about that really does feed into the way that we see American politics today, which is not just religiously, but in terms of secular issues too, has kind of moved somewhat more to the margins.
I think that, I think it'd be a good time to now, let's look at 2020. Let's look at the Democratic candidates. And given your focus and background, I mean, what are you seeing in terms of how religion is or is not? You mentioned previously about Bernie earlier in the discussion, so maybe bring that to the fore again, and how what's different this time, or maybe what's the same.
I haven't seen much yet in terms of an explicit discussion of religion, but that doesn't, of course, mean it's not there, only that it's not the top talking point, often that it can run under the surface. The recent statistics, thinking about this 81% that's had so many people talking for the last 4 years, a recent poll by the Pew Research Center suggests that about 77% of white evangelicals think that President Trump is doing a good job. So it's not that far removed from the 81% who voted for him. And that roughly 75% of white evangelicals say that they will consider voting for Trump again in 2020, which suggests that not that much has changed, at least on the surface. If you look closely, actually, there are some quite deep splits within the evangelical movement. There's a kind of liberal evangelical wing who's been very critical of Trump. Now, whether they will come to play a bigger role as the election heats up, I don't know. We'll see. But the other interesting thing, I think, is that looking at some of the Democratic frontrunners, having said that the Democrats have often found it quite difficult to talk about the faith, actually, of some of the leading candidates, Bernie Sanders being the exception, some of the other candidates are actually very outspoken about their faith, in the sense they're learning the lessons of Clinton and Obama, and realizing that actually this is a group of people that they need to reach out to, and that just not talking about religion is not going to be able to do it.
Well, I guess what's interesting, I think, if you think of some of the ones, what we can call front runners at this stage. For those of those listening, we're recording this in sort of mid to late February, but we've got Pete Buttigieg. I mean, I think it's interesting, the millennial in the race. We've got a bunch of baby boomers and we've got a couple of millennials, and no one from my generation running in this time, really. But he seems to be the one that's most out there about his faith, but he's an interesting candidate in that regard.
He is interesting, and I think he's been very interesting because obviously he's openly gay, he's married, and in a sense, nobody, I think, certainly I don't doubt his religious faith. It's clearly important to him, but it seems to me that part of what he's doing is trying to challenge this idea that you if you are gay, you can't be religious, right? Or that the church will not embrace people who are gay. So there seems to be a message there in which he's saying, I'm gay and I'm religious and my faith is important to me and it shapes my life, and those two things aren't polar opposites, which in the kind of the culture of the culture wars that has been so dominant, is a message that actually probably needs to get out there a little bit more into the mainstream discussion. So I think it's partly about the fact that his faith is important to him. It's a natural way in which he speaks, but there's a broader message, I think, that's going out there too.
Yeah, but what I find interesting about him is that, all that said, progressive millennials can't stand him. You know,
No, I think he's sort of portrayed himself very much as this sort of middle of the road Democrat, and after 4 years of Trump and the Republicans, and even longer than that, if you think about the way in which Republicans had control of Congress and in the last few years of Obama's presidency and obstructed legislation, I think there's a lot of people who want the Democrats to be more active in opposing that, and he is not really one of them. He seems to be much more of that kind of mainstream, we have to work across the political divide, and I'm not sure how many people want to hear that right now.
Well, and I also think, I mean, it's who he is. He's a former McKinsey consultant, management consultant. He's, he's just, it's an interesting one because Bernie Sanders is the oldest. Well, he may be actually now surpassed by Bloomberg, I think. They're both about the same age, but Bernie Sanders, I think they're both 78. Bernie's polling really well with millennials, and Buttigieg is doing really well with the older ones.
Yes.
But maybe this gets to this point is what's happening in, we've been talking this entire time as sort of assuming that the U.S. is almost kind of static and sort of religious views have been staying the same for many decades now. But there's been some things happening in the last maybe even as little as the last 10 years or so in terms of how people identify with religion. Do you have any research or anything you've noticed on that front?
Yeah, so a few years ago, the opinion polls that look at religious beliefs and their relationship with politics, and there are a number of them, started talking about nuns, as in Nones, not the religious orders, and this idea of people who do not identify with a particular faith. And I think it's important to understand when people first started talking about the nuns, people were assuming we were talking about sort of agnostics and atheists, people of no faith whatsoever. And actually, it's much more complicated than that. And the nuns also encompass a group which often gets classed as nothing in particular. And I think it's important to note that actually a very large percentage of those people argue that faith is important, often that they believe in God, but often classify themselves as spiritual, not religious, and don't see themselves as allied with any particular church or denomination or faith. So the nuns are not necessarily people absent of faith, but people who do not identify along traditional lines. Current figures suggest that may well be around 25% of American voters, which is a significant proportion when you think about it. And given that faith tends to be, or has historically been, quite a factor in determining how people vote, the idea that there may be 1 in 4 Americans where perhaps that does not apply is sort of an interesting one to throw into the mix. Now, the sense is that for 2016, that didn't necessarily make a huge impact on the outcome, but there is a group there. And interestingly, one of the things that group consistently report about why they don't identify with a particular faith or denomination is that they are put off by the increasing connection between religion and politics. Now, if that is indeed the fact, that doesn't necessarily bode well for Republicans, who have, as we've already talked about, sort of come to be seen as the party of faith, or at least the party of a particular kind of faith and connections with politics.
So this may not, we don't know yet how much of an impact it's going to have on 2020, or it may have somewhat of an impact, but will it be enough to move the election one way or the other? But in terms of the medium to long term, because this is a rapidly growing group, isn't it? This 25%, it could be, in a few years, it'll be a third. It will be, I would imagine.
Potentially. I mean, the first time this really appeared was about 2007, when it accounted for about 16% of the population. So it's jumped, by 7 percentage points in 9 years between the two big surveys, which is a significant group of the population of the electorate.
Okay. I think my producer's whispering in my ear saying it's hard to believe, but the time's gone by very quickly, and that we need to kind of wrap up here. But I think, Emma, I just want, before we do that, just maybe you could tell us a little about yourself. You spent a year in Wisconsin, is that right?
I did. Go Packers.
Yeah, I knew that. I thought you were going to say that. Everyone who spends time in Wisconsin becomes this rabid Packers fan.
You can't help it. Yeah. So as an undergraduate, I had the opportunity to do a year's study abroad. I was at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. So yes, it's sort of my adopted home state, even though I haven't had a chance to be back there in a while.
Yeah. And what were your impressions as a student going there, and your impressions of religion in America with your year there?
Well, if I tell you, pretty much my entire career and the stuff that I've worked on came out of the studies of my year there, both in terms of the Supreme Court. I got interested in school prayer, actually, to hark back to something that we mentioned before. So yeah, I sort of have that to thank for the career that I have.
Oh, very good. And I think I think that's very interesting, and also because Milwaukee's going to be there's even an article just a couple of days ago still saying that Milwaukee could be the kingmaker, if you will, in terms of the election. It kind of was last time around as well. So we might have to, if Milwaukee does, we'll have to have you
Come
back
back
on.
to it.
Yeah, I think so. I just wanted to close there. Emma, it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Really enjoyed it. We've been talking about the film Most Hated Family in America. Don't avoid it anymore like I did. I think it's worth a watch, and the subsequent episodes that Louis Theroux did. Where can what's the best way of following you in terms of any research or books or anything that you putting out?
Probably easiest to find me through the University of East Anglia website. I may be one of the few people who is not on Twitter.
Okay.
So that's probably the easiest way to go.
We'll have show notes. We'll put a link to you in the show notes. So I just wanted to shout out to Spiritland Studios again. Thank you for the wonderful hospitality. And to please remember to like us and share us with your friends and family wherever you happen to listen or watch podcasts. And do get in touch with us and let us know what you think. We'd be keen to hear any ideas for future shows, guests, and questions for future guests, indeed. So this is Factual America, signing off.
You've been listening to Factual America. This podcast is produced by Alamo Pictures, specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for international audiences. Head on down to the show notes for more information about today's episode, our guest, and the team behind the podcast. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Alamo Pictures to be the first to hear about new productions, festivals we're attending, and to connect with our team. Our homepage is alamopictures.co.uk.